We're glad to welcome you here to an event that has numerous partners and numerous collaborators. On behalf of the Issam Institute for Public Policy and the Asfari Institute for Citizenship and for Civil Society and Citizenship, my name is Rania Masri, and I'm very glad that you all are here to discuss this critical issue that faces us in Lebanon. The issue of racism, the issue of the self, the issue of the other, and the issue of institutionalized discrimination that we have in Lebanon. We have a very rich panel, and I'm going to be introducing all the panelists at the same time and then giving them the floor. We're going to start with Noura Balbaki from HBF, and then we're going to be going on to Nisreen and Francisca Ankrah and Bogdanska from the Mixed Feelings Project, and then we'll be ending with Roula Hamati from the Insan Association. All of these individuals will be presenting either on their individual projects or on the aspects of institutionalized racism that face us in Lebanon. They've been asked to speak very briefly because we want to spend the most significant time talking with you, talking together, making it an interactive session in which together we get to explore our own experiences about racism in Lebanon and our strategies for overcoming these problems that we're facing in this country. So without further ado, I give the floor to
Yes, hi, I'm the project manager for Lebanon at Heinrich Foundation. I would like to welcome you all. And I would like to thank Issam Institute, the Asfari Institute, and Insan Foundation for co-hosting this event. So basically, HBF has supported Mixed Feelings in 2012 in its first phase, and it's supporting it now in its second phase, while it will be roving around 5 different areas in Lebanon, showing 45 photographs and textual portraits. I would also like to thank Nisreen and Marta on their efforts shedding light on the subject of racism, which unfortunately is deeply rooted in the minds of the Lebanese. And that's all. Thanks again.
Hello, hi, my name is Marta Bogdanska. I'm a photographer and also co-curator of the project. And I will just briefly tell you about the beginnings of the project and how Nisreen and me started doing it. So in 2011, Nisreen told me that we should meet and do a project together about racism. And she had an interesting idea how to approach the topic, because usually it's spoken about from the migrant workers' perspective, and it's of course very important, but we wanted to find a new entry point to make the Lebanese think and talk about in a different way. That's why we chose the Mixed Lebanese. So we started taking some photographs and talking to people, and when we had a kind of 10 portraits ready, we approached the HBS, and we are very grateful that you are with us till now and supporting the project. So we have the collaboration with HBS since 2011, 2012. And this year we are moving the project, as Noor mentioned, to 5 other locations. It already was shown in Alt City, in Hamra. And after this exhibition, it's moving to NDU, to Notre Dame University. And after that to Sur, to Baladia, and we have a collaboration with the municipality in Sur. And after that, the 5th location is going to be most probably in Tripoli, which is in the works. And we would like to thank everyone who participated in the project. Some of you are here today. I hope you will be taking part in discussion. And we want to thank all our friends who were helping us throughout those years to complete the project and are still helping. Thank you so much, and I hope you will enjoy the panel and discussion.
Hello, everyone. So you know who I am. Marta introduced me. I'm here today with Francisca Ankrah, who will be speaking also on the project. And before I start, I would also like to specifically thank the Issam Institute and Michael for all the work they've been doing, and the Asfari Institute as well, for Rania and for Marta for being here, and Insan for always being on this project from 2012 till now. I'm going to start with a presentation because I lose my thoughts very quickly, so we will do that. If I'm not speaking into the mic, someone just point me out. Okay. So, Mixed Feelings, the project, it's entitled Mixed Feelings, Racism and Othering from a Lebanese perspective, so the title is quite self-explanatory. It comprises, like Marta said, 33 portraits of individuals who are of African or Asian heritage. These are a few of the pictures. You're going to see part of the exhibition. Actually, the part of the exhibition that's staying at AUB for 5 days is next to the cafeteria and the green vitrines. I'm sure anyone who's in AUB knows exactly where that is. And there are a few photos here in the room attached to this auditorium. About a third of the participants were interviewed and were asked to share their experiences during this, the research phase of the project, which was in 2011. And what the project touched on was a selection of subjects and themes. So obviously it touches on the idea of what is race, on racism in Lebanon, on racialization, on othering, on classism, on various number of topics and intersecting oppressions. The interviews themselves revealed some very interesting themes. There are a lot, so I'm not going to go through them. If you have any questions after this, I would be very glad to elaborate, but I'll just mention them by points. So we, from the talks of the participants, we have themes of body as a site for othering, the gender theme of racialization. So racialization is very different for women as that it is for men. The idea of reciprocity in identity formation, using jokes as a tool to other or in racism. Also, what the talks kind of revealed, and this was very, very important, because racism, when you discuss it on a social level with people, it seems like an individual problem, but actually the talks revealed that there were very institutionalized forms of racism, very systematic forms of racism. So we notice racism in in social systems, so like families, in the policing system, in media, and the educational system, and so on. The talks also revealed the idea the idea of performativity and the fallacy of race. And they also revealed certain coping mechanisms that people use to deal with racism in the country, which is quite interesting. And finally, the themes of racialization, which probably a lot of you know, but I'm going to list them anyway. So you have ideas of like the monkey, the slave, the dirty skin, the maid, body that embodies the bestial, the silanki, the sexual promiscuous, the chocolate face, the nigger sponge. So you have all these themes that also came out in the talk. Why did we pick mixed heritage people to talk about racism? So Marta briefly went over this. The reason why we picked mixed heritage Lebanese are, first of all, a lot of us are subject to racism, okay, to race thinking, to racialization and othering. So the same processes, almost the same processes of how migrant domestic workers are othered in Lebanon, we kind of go through the same thing, because we are seen as, we are seen as who we are not seen as who we are. So you are often identified by what you are not. Sorry. So on some level, we are occupiers of the us versus them. And this is also why we wanted to discuss racism through a mixed heritage perspective, is that when you discuss it through a migrant domestic worker perspective, it's easily appropriated into a discussion about class. We're not racist, we're classist. We wouldn't want to swim with our maid, even if she was Palestinian or Syrian or Lebanese. So using Lebanese to discuss racism kind of takes back the conversation back and centers it on racism, because you can eliminate all these excuses. Also, being mixed Lebanese of African or Asian heritage blurs racial lines. So it questions the idea of what does it mean to be Lebanese? What color do you need to be Lebanese? What kind of features do you need to be Lebanese? What kind of hair do you have to be Lebanese? So it questions all these interesting things, and it eliminates the binarism discourse, which is the us versus them. There is no us versus them when you're talking about Lebanese of color. It challenges modes of exclusion, inclusion, and othering. It, like I said, challenges the social construct of race. It's been proven already that race doesn't exist. We'll go back to that later. Also, we did mixed heritage Lebanese because AUB inspired us to do this project. So when I approached Marta, the reason I told her this is because a year before I met Marta, I was talking to a friend who did a workshop at AUB. And she was very active at the time. Her name is Simba Rousseau. And she was very, very active at the time, working on cultural exchange initiatives. And she also gave workshops, and she was a photojournalist, and she was really wanted to fight racism in Lebanon. So she gave this workshop at AUB, and she was discussing with the students about migrant domestic workers and how inherently racist the kafil, the sponsorship system, is. So she got the usual response from students. I'm going to, Lebanese are prejudiced towards one another. So, I mean, this is how the country is, you need to deal with it. Other people said, what do you expect? The only black people we see are maids, they're uneducated, they're poor. So, I mean, of course, we're going to assume or treat them this way. She tried to explain to them, well, I think it's. She tried to use the example of waiters. So, for instance, if it's a Lebanese waiter, this is sort of a position where you serve. Why do you treat waiters better? And they were like, yeah, but waiters are usually university students, so they're educated and they're just doing this to pay their way through school. So, I mean, this is a different dynamic. And the last thing she brought up, one of the other things she brought up in her workshop was that, okay, what about if we fix the labor law and then we completely eliminate the need for live-in maids, so we don't have the kafil system, you don't have to live in someone's house. And a lot of the students in this class said, no, it's better for them because they don't get paid as much, you know, they wouldn't be able to afford housing. So no, they should live in the houses, it's good for them. So she then decided, and the majority of class obviously denied that the treatment of migrant domestic workers was racist. So then she said, okay, so I have a Lebanese friend who's black, and she also faces racism. How do you explain this? And then most of the class agreed, and they were like, okay, well, if it's an African Lebanese, then they should not be treated this way because they're Lebanese. So when she told me this, I was like, oh, that's quite interesting. And then the other thing that she said that was quite interesting in this workshop was that most of the class, well, not most, she said like half of the class did not understand the concept of black Lebanese. They're like, how can you be Lebanese and black? I was just like, what do you mean? So when she told me the story, we were like, we need to do a project on Lebanese of color because they would probably be the best people to talk about racism, and that way you can't easily eliminate the discussion and say, well, you're outsiders, you don't know anything. No, sorry, we're Lebanese. So the inspiration is that workshop, and also personal experiences, my personal experiences, Simba's personal experiences. So she's a black American. She's been asked many times to clean houses, so from her personal experiences. And today we have Francisca. I met her a week ago, and I was very happy to meet her because NDU, the team there talked about her so much. And I wonder, Francisca, if you would like to give us maybe one personal story, and then we'll end here.
Of course. Brief introduction. My name is Francisca Ankrah. I was born and raised in Lebanon, and I've lived here for 20 years. There are many experiences that I've had concerning this topic, but the one I chose to tell you today is quite interesting because it's one of my first experiences regarding racism. So I was around 7 or 8 years old, and I went to the summer camp this one time. And one day I decided that I have to go and socialize and make friends and everything. So I approached this kid who was around my age. He was like 7 or 8 years old as well, and his younger brother. And I'm like, hey guys, I just want to play with you and everything. And the kid goes, لا ما فيك تلعبي معنا أنت سريلانكية. Here I was like, what? A translation, you can't play with us because you're Sri Lankan. So here I got like really confused. I was like, what? So I look at the kid and I'm like, I'm from Ghana. So he's like, لا وقت تكبر بتصير سريلانكية. Translation, when you grow up, you're going to be a Sri Lankan or / a maid. So it kind of shocked me how they associate the color of my skin to a profession and the profession to an actual occupation. And this really set me back because for the next couple of weeks, I really don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to go outside. I kept crying because people kept bullying me because of the color of my skin. So yeah, that's basically it.
And I want Ichlas to share one personal experience about her daughters in school, because I just remembered this article in Daily Star a few days ago where she was interviewed. So if you can tell us a bit about your daughter's experience in school. And who are you? And no, in Arabic if you want, whatever you're comfortable.
اوكي ماشي. أنا اسمي إخلاص أحمد جمعة من السودان. أنا متزوجة مع زوجي عايشة هون بلبنان وعندي 3 أطفال. أطفالي كانوا أول واحدة هي عمرها 3-4 سنين، خدتها بمدرسة رسمية، مدرسة لبنانية، مدرسة رسمية. أنا في منطقة ما في إلا أنا بس وولادي، خدتها المدرسة، هي كانت لوحدها بالمدرسة. في الوقت هيدا بنتي كانت وديتها على المدرسة، بس كانت كتير تتعاني من العنصرية، كانوا كتير بيضربوها وكتير تتعاني من الضرب والعنصرية. دائما بينادوا لها شوكولا وانت من وين، وبيحاولوا انه بيشوفوا لها بشرتها انه هل تمحي ولا لا، يعني انه لون ومن وين جايبه اللون ده. دائما يعني تتعذب بهذا الشيء. بس اكثر شيء اللي هو احرني انه من المشكله انه بنتي كانت صغيره، وكنت انا رحت حكيت مع المعلمات انه ححكوا مع الأطفال، لأنه الأطفال ما بيفهموا شيء، أنتوا حاولوا إنه أحكوا معهم لا يقدروا يتعاملوا معهم، لأنه الطفل ما بيفهم شيء. هن قالوا لا نحن ما فينا نعمل شيء. وضليت إنه تستمر بالمدرسة لمدة 3-4 أشهر. بعد 4 أشهر في مرة يوم من الأيام كسروا لها إيدها بالمدرسة. رحت اشتكيت للمديرة، قلت لها بنتي كسروا لها إيدها، ليه أنت بتعملوا كده؟ دائما تتعاملوا معنا، نحن كلنا سويا، يعني سواء كان إحنا بشرتنا بيضاء أو سمراء، نحن كلنا بني آدمين، كلنا أولاد 9 أشهر، ما مفروض أنت تتعاملي مع كده. ردة فعل تبع المديرة إنه قالت لي إذا بدك شيلي بنتك، أنا فيني ما أعمل شيء. وأنا اضطريت شلت بنتي، عادت سنة بلا دراسة. يعني مشان هيك إنه بنقول مش المشكلة إحنا نكون بشرتنا بيضاء، نحن كلنا بشر، يعني كلنا بني آدمين، ما بيكون سواء كنا فارقة سواء كنا عرب، يعني كلنا بني آدمين، يعني شو ما كان يكون. ونتمنى الشعب اللبناني يعاملنا كنحن بشر مثلنا ومثلهم، يعني ما في فرق بيناتنا. اللهم هو بشرتنا سمراء، بس البشرة السمراء ما في أحلى منها، يعني مشان هيك هيدا رسالتي.
Thank you, Ichlas. Is there anyone who did not understand what she said? Okay.
I will briefly translate. So Ichlas was speaking about her own story. She is from Sudan. She has been living here. She has 3 children. Her youngest child, a daughter, was placed in the public school system in Lebanon, and she was constantly being beaten and being harassed, being called words such as chocolate, where are you from, where'd you get your color from? The teacher would not get involved. Despite Ichlas bringing this up to the teacher numerous times, the teacher refused to get involved in this severe verbal bullying and physical attacking against the daughter. After 4 months of this behavior, the girl's arm was actually broken. She was bullied so extensively they broke her arm. And when Ichlas went to tell the teacher's response was, well, you should just remove your daughter from the school. So again, we see an entire system refusing to protect this child. And in the words of Ichlas, what she's asking for is basically that Lebanese, we learn to treat each other and to treat others as human beings, very simply as human beings. Not only was the child physically harmed, but she also had lost an entire year of education by being placed out of a school system, and she took a year to be placed back into the school system.
Hello, my name is Roula. I'm from Insan Association. I would just like to give a brief introduction about Insan. In the early 2000s, Insan started out because a group of volunteers started to notice that a lot of children were not being accepted into normal schools. And the reason why those children were not being accepted was because they were not Lebanese, so they were different. So from that need, the Insan school started out to give migrant children the right to education. Insan has been active in the field of racism and discrimination for a long time. And it was also one of the few organizations that called racism in Lebanon in its early stages. What Nisreen and Marta and Francisca has touched upon was relating to the 2 aspects of racism, the individual experience, but also the institutionalized aspect. Ichlas gave also an example that goes to the heart of the institutionalized aspect of racism. So when racism becomes part of the school system, when it becomes part of the administration, when it becomes part of the government, this is when racism starts to have like a real life effect on people. Okay, so I would just like to introduce like how is racism institutionalized in Lebanon. The first thing, there is no law actually specifically addressing racism in Lebanon, be it positively or negatively. So there is no law that protects people who are abused, racially abused. But there are no laws that specifically set out racist provisions. However, that being said, there are a number of policies and administrative decisions, governmental decisions that perpetuate racist consequences on people. I guess the first instance that comes to mind is the categorization of workers in Lebanon. Many of you are already aware there are a large number of workers in Lebanon. But what most of you don't know is that they fall within different categories. There are 4 categories for migrant workers. The first category is actually people who do white-collar jobs. For instance, they are the CEOs, the owners of companies, self-employed people like doctors, like engineers. And although this classifies people in terms of occupation, when you look at the racial composition of those categories, this is when racism becomes apparent. So the first category is mostly dominated by Northern Americans, by Europeans, by Westerners. And then you have the second category, and the second category are workers who are hired by national companies, who are hired by international companies, who do not fall under the first category. Then comes the third category, and that category are the people who do menial jobs. So for instance, they are employed in agriculture, they are employed in construction, they are employed in all sorts of other jobs. And those jobs are generally undertaken by, for instance, Syrians, by Sudanese, by other Arab nationalities that are migrants. And the last category is a specific category for migrant domestic workers. As I'm sure you already know, migrant domestic workers come, for instance, from Ethiopia, they come from Bangladesh, they come from the Philippines, and Sri Lanka, and other countries. Although those systems do not specify, this system does not specify the nationality of the worker, there is a very deep racial composition to those people. Adding to that, that system of classification gives different rights to people. So for instance, people from the first and second category, they have the right to family reunification. What that means is that if a migrant comes to Lebanon and they fall under the first and second category, they are allowed to bring their spouses and children with them. Third and fourth category migrants don't have these rights. So this is where this starts to affect people in their real lives. The classification that is racist at heart starts affecting people. The other example that Nisreen addressed was the kafala system. And from what Nisreen said was she didn't want to incorporate domestic workers into this project because it falls into discussion of class versus racism. What I want to say about that is that there is a racist aspect to the kafala system. So I want to give you an example. Filipino migrant workers are amongst the highest earning migrant workers in the country. And why is that? It's because they are given a better attribute compared to their dark-skinned domestic workers. So they are thought to be as more intelligent, smarter, better at doing work. So they attribute all sorts of these racist stereotypes to the Filipino, and this reflects in a wage differential whereby the Filipinos are the highest earning domestic workers, whereas, for instance, the Bangladeshi are the lowest earning. There are also all sorts of explanations that are associated with the domestic worker. So we don't let her out because she can't take care of herself. So this also patriarchal discussion and patriarchal discourse about domestic workers. Just because they are racially different, we assume that they cannot take care of themselves. This discussion, we wouldn't hear it about Lebanese women. You would never see someone talking about Lebanese woman, she cannot go out of the house because she cannot take care of herself. So this is where the racial lines start to appear. Recently, we also have very, very racist policies that the government has been undertaken. The first one started the beginning of this year, and it was about not allowing migrant workers of the third and fourth categories who have children born in Lebanon to continue to have a residence permit for their children. And here it relates back to what we said about migrant workers from those categories not having the right to family reunification, but it also talks about the state's interference in the family life of individuals, just based on the difference that it attributes to them. Also, what Ichlas has talked about was racism in education. And unfortunately, the Ministry of Education has practically made it impossible for migrant workers to register their children in public schools. and now in semi-private schools. So what's going on is that migrant workers cannot register in the complementary and secondary cycles. The primary cycle is limited to children who have been in school for 3 years, so practically impossible. And now a new decision has stopped subsidizing semi-private schools for migrant children. We are now faced with a situation where migrant children also do not have even the basic rights of education, which is outlined in many international treaties and obligations that Lebanon has signed on to. Just to wrap up, I think I talked a little bit more. Just to wrap up, well, it's very important to raise awareness that racism exists. It's also very important to present it as an issue because it's usually talked about in society as a non-issue. So racism does exist, racism does affect people, and it's very important to talk about it. But at the same time, for us, it's also very important to have a mechanism to address and to provide legal redress for people who are subject to racism. So what's also needed, and I would like to hear more from you about this issue, is that to have a law that basically that talks about racism and that gives people the way legal redress for being subjected to racism. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Very moving testimony. Before I give the floor to the audience for your own comments and your own questions, I just want to recap some of the essentials that were stated. You know, although we can say very clearly that race itself doesn't exist, that race itself is a social construct, that race itself is based completely on contextualizations and based on power structures within those particular communities. Racism, however, very much exists. And it exists in Lebanon not only through individual discourses, not only through family and societal discourses, but fundamentally empowered through institutional frameworks, be it through the laws that do exist, as the laws that were just presented, or through the laws that do not exist and therefore support certain policies. So we have this framework that we're living within in Lebanon. So then the question becomes for us, given that we do live in a racist society, how can we continue to cleanse ourselves as individuals from racism that is around us? I mean, the way I look at racism is similar to how I look at sexism and a lot of other issues. If you are able to live within such a contaminated swimming pool, you cannot but get a bit of that bacteria on your skin and in your psyche and in your thinking process. It becomes almost impossible to be truly cleansed of racism once we live within a racist society. So we take a lot of individual efforts to cleanse ourselves of the racism that we see all around us. How do we start from within and extend it without to then empower our society and transform our institutions and transform our laws and transform our media so that we can actually be creating a situation that is free of this kind of individual discrimination and individual judgment? There was another critical question that was posed, which is, what does it actually mean to be Lebanese? Well, you know, is there a particular way that a Lebanese has to look and has to act and has to dress and has to speak and has to think? Myself, having been Lebanese for hundreds of years, I'm constantly told by Lebanese that I'm not Lebanese. So there is still a framework as to what a Lebanese person should look like and should behave, and it would be good for us to be able to explore, why do we do that? Why do we always section off and try to classify people as the other and thereby make it easy to place judgment against and to behave with them differently than we behave with the self, which again is a very arbitrary construct that we continue to be playing around. And there was another phrase that was said that's a very powerful phrase for us as Lebanese or as individuals living within this problematic society that we have, which is, you know, we're prejudiced against each other as Lebanese, so it's okay for us to be discriminatory against others because we do it against ourselves, which can be, you know, summarized into وقفت علي الشغلة يعني ما كلنا هيك شو وقفت علي. So we have this kind of acceptance of judgment and of defeatism and of the situation as it is within Lebanon, which we also have to dissect and deconstruct and overpower because it is deeply problematic. I do disagree, though, on one issue, which is I think that a lot of the language that's used in racism is also used in sexism. Both are based on a sense of superiority. Both are based on one community or one individual knowing more than the other. And both then tend to limit judgment and limit freedom of movement. So we still do have a great deal of women in our community who are not allowed freedom of movement and mobility and education because they are women and because by virtue of being female, we therefore have less of an agency and less of an intelligence, and we need the man to protect us. Just as the migrant domestic worker in our home actually needs the Lebanese matriarch in the home to protect her from the damage that can happen to her if she were to mingle with others. It's a lot of that same language that's used with the concept that we, however we define the self, are superior to this other, and we use that sense of superiority to empower and to pass judgment and to limit and to weaken. So we have all of these layers, and of course, we have classism in this society, which brings us to how we actually look at racism. Because once we recognize that racism is way beyond the way that I look at you, or the way that we individually look at each other, but that it is structures of power and structures of privilege. So consequently, the worst individual that one can be in this country is poor, female, and black. Because then you've got all these layers of oppression placed against that individual. So that would be the most difficult individual to, and for that individual to then be born of a Lebanese mother and a non-Lebanese father means they're also denied nationality and statehood. So with all these issues, we would like to bring the floor to you all and to open it to a discussion. So if you have any personal experiences you want to share, as long as they're short and to the point, please feel free to do so. If you also have any questions that you want to explore, please definitely feel free to do so. We want to create as much as of a safe space as possible. That's why I started it off by acknowledging that by living in a racist, sexist, classist, sectarian, deeply problematic society, we can't but constantly have those bacteria within us. So to recognize our own problems so we can step forward. So with that, the floor is yours for any comments or questions that you all have. And if I could trouble you, if you feel comfortable identifying yourself, that would be great, just for communication.
Well, hello, my name is Nadine. Well, this is too loud, actually. I want to, first of all, tell you that I'm very proud of every single one of your initiatives. And it gives me a lot of hope to know that people are actually actively working to make a change in the society. But the question is, how are you, because you're technically the experts working with these people and these issues, so you research ways to know how to actually resolve these issues on so many different levels. So we had the introduction about the problems in Lebanon and what we're facing, but now I would like to know what's the plan for you to change that, if it's okay.
In the framework of the project, what we're trying to do to tackle racism in Lebanon is, first of all, define it. Okay, so racism has its core elements, but it's also quite specific to different geographical and time spaces. So the first step is to first talk that we do have racism. It's not a classism issue only, it's a racism issue. And then to define it in its geopolitical time specific context. After doing that, we can also basically, I mean, when I mentioned coping mechanisms in the talks of people who participate in the project, this is also very interesting because although it's an individual way of coping with racism, we can also explore the methods that are used by people to see how we can, I don't know, develop something out of these coping mechanisms and use maybe on a larger scale or as a system or, I don't know. How else? Insan has done a lot of, I mean, I did a workshop once with Insan, for instance. So I know you guys do a lot of things in terms of tackling racism in your work. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, for Insan, I talked briefly about the school. So it's like one way of combating discrimination. It's one way of combating racism by offering like alternative places where children who are discriminated against, they can study They can socialize, they can play, they have a space, they even have a community center. So that's one way of tackling racism. We also, for instance, we also work on abolishing the kafala system. We work in advocacy on this issue. So that's also, we want to counsel this racist practice. There's a lot of work being done, for instance, on trying to replace the kafala system by many NGOs on the ground. A lot of NGOs also offer services for migrant children and migrants themselves to help them combat the consequences that happen to them as a result of the racist system.
That answers your question. I mean, hopefully.
Any other questions or comments from the floor?
مرحبا، أنا اسمي ندى الشيخ، من أب لبناني ووالدتي من ليبيريا. للحقيقة نحن تعرضنا شوي للعنصرية لما كان خيي صغير لعمر 4 سنين. رحنا مدرسة عراس النبع وبالتحديد مدرسة العاملية. ممكن أول مرة بيشوفوا ولد غامق بالمدرسة، فبيقوم طفل بيبزق على ايد خيي وبيحفها مشان يشوف اذا رح يتحل ايده رح يتغير اللون. فخيي تأثر وضربه على وجهه وطلع له دم من منخاره. وهرب خيي من المدرسة وراح يتخبى عند حدا بيقربنا. بالمدرسة بدل ما تدافع عن خيي طلبت ورا أهلي وبدهم يفصلوه من المدرسة. أنا بفتكر إذا هيدا أستاذ تعامل بهيدا الأسلوب وما دافع عن المساواة، لازم يكون في قانون يكون جدي لحماية الأطفال من العنف من المدارس. لو كنا نحن ببلد متطور كان أهلي بيرفعوا دعوة لهذا التصرف اللي حصل عليه خيي. وبفتكر إنه المدارس هي أكتر وسيلة وطريقة لتحد من العنصرية بين العالم، لأنه هي بتربي أجيال جيدة وصالحة وتقدر تعلمهم إنه كل الناس نفس الدرجة. هذا بخصوص الأطفال. بخصوص المدام ما حكيت عن اللي بيجوا الناس من برا مشان يشتغلوا بلبنان، كتير بيتعرضوا لأساليب مهينة بده يغيروا لهم طريقة حياتهم. إذا أنا مسيحية بجيب البنت بدي أعملها مسيحية، إذا مسلمة بدي لبسها على راسها، بدي أعلمها الصلاة، بدي إياها تتوضى. يعني شيء مش معقول هالتصرفات. هذا بالنسبة للبنان. هون هلا نحن صار الحرب وانجبرنا نرجع فترة على أفريقيا. يعني بقلكن للصراحة إنه هون بلبنان ما في يعني في شوية عنصرية يعني بسيطة بتمرق ظروف صغيرة. شوفوا بأفريقيا اللبنانية، يعني أنا تفاجأت. يعني ما قلت هولي مش لبنانية، أنا ما كنت عايشة بلبنان، كنت عايشة بأمريكا. يعني إذا بدهم يحكوا عن شخص أفريقي بيقولوا عبد، إجا العبد، راح العبد، قديش بتدفع له للعبد، بيسرق العبد. يعني كأنه نحن اللبنانية هون ملائكة، ما بنخطئ، ما بنسرق، ما بنكذب، ما بنزني، ما بنجيب أطفال منزتهم بالطريق. والأفريقية أبداً يعني ناس زيرو ما بيسووا أبداً. Thank you.
شكرا كثير. I will just very briefly try to translate the essence of what Nada Sheikh has presented. She spoke about 3 issues. The first, she gave her own personal experience when her brother was at a school system and he was considered dark, so a fellow student actually spit on his skin to try to see if the color could come off, to which her brother responded by punching him in the nose. And so based on that, she's asking for a law within schools to actually protect children from this kind of bullying, and recognizing that schools themselves can serve as a very critical venue to decrease the strength of racism, since schools are or they should be a point of education for generations. She also raised an issue with regards to migrant workers, that not only do we have all these institutional systems against them, but oftentimes the family that then brings in a migrant worker tries to transform her according to the family's religion and tries to transform her culture. And the third issue that she brought up is the way that Lebanese themselves as individuals behave in Africa, where their racism then really expands magnificently. And particularly the use of a particular word in Arabic that we use when we refer to black people. So rather than calling black people aswad, oftentimes they're referred to as abid, which is the Arabic word for slave. There's a comment in the back.
Hi, my name is Hamad Mihiddin. I'm a Lebanese university student and a member of Red Cross Youth. First, I would like to say I have a cousin. He has a Lebanese mother and a Syrian father. So I don't think there's a difference between Lebanese and Syrians when it comes to race, but some of my family members and our neighbors, they always call him Yasuri, Yasuri as an insult. At this point, I would like to say, it's not just when it comes to racism for Lebanese, it's not about color only, it's about nationality too. We think we're very advanced over other of our neighbor countries, but we belong to the same race practically. From this point of view. From the other point of view, I have a little brother, and I was teaching him in his school book. And I realized there are stories about people from different nations. When I looked in the stories, I see colored people, Africans, wearing nothing but leopard skin or animal skin, and living in a forest. Then I flipped a couple of pages and I see some non-colored kids, like European, and they're holding like diplomas, and they're in a civilized, let's say civilized environment. I would like to say, it starts from the educational point of view. This is where kids get most of their views about racism. We see a black person, we realize we say that he lives in that environment. He doesn't have an educational level or a degree. I believe that in order for us to cut down a bit of the racism in educational books, we should teach the children that educational level doesn't have to be in relation with someone's race. And I think there are more people like you, like some educated colored people, should go more to isolated places in Lebanon and tell them there are some colored educated people. For instance, from where I come from, I haven't met anybody who is black and like holds university degrees, but doesn't mean you can't. For children growing up in that environment, I can't blame them for being racist. It's not always their fault. We should start from a young educational level to teach them that it's not okay to be racist. Thank you.
You want me to?
I just want to make just one observation or comment. Thank you so much for sharing the story of your friend. That's very interesting, and it brings an interesting point. I only want to make one comment about the education. I do agree that you have to address it at a very young level, racism, but I don't think the thing that you should maybe teach children is that there are black people who are educated. What they should be taught is that regardless of where you're from, regardless of your educational level, and regardless of your background, you need to respect all people. So me going to places and showing that they're educated African people does nothing. I mean, I am sorry to use anecdotal examples, but I have a very good friend of mine who just left the country because she's just had enough of Lebanon. She's 28 years old. Congolese, born here, speaks only Arabic, has never been to Congo except once this year. And she told me the first time I met her, she told me the first time I went to my first semester in USEC, in Catholic University, a bunch of Lebanese girls came up to me and they asked me, and they had seen her around campus, so they knew she was a student, and they came up to her and said, and no, what's your major? Cleaning toilets? So even if you're educated, they still treat you, you will still face this kind of treatment. So that's my comment regarding exposing children to educated people of color. But I think you can address other things in this.
Yeah, I have two additional comments. And again, I second Nisreen's gratitude to your comment and to some of the excellent points that you raised. I would say with regards to textbooks that we need to transform the textbook completely. And many of our textbooks actually in our public school systems need to be completely transformed. So we shouldn't be trying to create a bandage to the racism that is present in our textbooks as much as we should toss them out and rewrite new ones. But 2 points that I want to talk about. One, you raised this issue of we and the Syrians are the same race versus others. And in many ways that's true because we consider ourselves socially, historically, linguistically, etc., to be of the same community. But I want to tackle this scientifically and to recognize that there is, scientifically speaking, no such thing as race. Okay, so even we can talk, there's linguistic differentiation, there are cultural differences, religious differences, national differences, but when it comes to racial differences, medically speaking, scientifically speaking, it's a social construct completely. I could take many of these pictures, okay, and change the names, and many of them look to me like my family, 100% Lebanese, okay? I can take many of these pictures and put them in the community where I was raised in North Carolina, and you think they were 100% African American, okay? Myself, being in North Carolina where I spent 20 years, I was often thought of by the African American community as being black. So I was seen as black, and people here may go, how are they seeing you as black? But it depends, again, on one social construct. I was completely rejected as white by everyone in the United States, okay, because we are not white. And if we can understand what that means, that it has very little to do with skin color and a lot to do with institutional powers and with privilege. Irish folk, Irish, if you all are familiar with how the typical Irish person looks like, red head, freckles, green eyes, were called white niggers in the States. Okay, so they were classified as exclusionary, okay, as being the other, and had institutionalized racism placed against them. So when we look at this and we try to break it down, really, it becomes even more complicated. So I just want us to be aware of our language. And I want us also to be aware of the kind of advocacy that we use. And I'm not picking on you, I'm actually very grateful that you said this, because we say it a lot in numerous circles, that there are some good people that we need to be emphasizing. We've seen this a lot now in the United States, given Islamophobia. Let's talk about the good Muslims. Or let me say that Muslims are not terrorists, okay? The moment I use that language, the moment I say you have some educated Africans, okay? It would be as if I'm saying this, no, you have some generous Lebanese. The moment I say you have some generous Lebanese, then the assumption is the majority of us are stingy. No, we have to be aware of our language. So we would be presenting people as exceptions and thereby reaffirming the rule itself, okay? Rather than saying that the whole construct needs to be thrown out, the whole question, the whole framework needs to be thrown out, which is difficult to do because it relies upon us to actually come up with a new framework. And that new framework would be looking at things institutionally. Why do we want to discriminate and distinguish amongst us? And you can come up with 4 different rules for the 4 of us on the panel and break us down. Why do we have this tendency institutionally to do this, economically to do this, individually to do this? Because we do it across the board. And if we weren't doing it for skin color, I was joking with Nisreen, we would do it for the thickness of our eyebrows. We would find a way to distinguish amongst us and break that down with why is that the case. And the last point that I want to raise is yes, you raised an excellent issue, which was regarding race versus nationality. And most definitely as Lebanese, we discriminate according to nationality. We also discriminate according to sect. internally amongst ourselves. So we have these layers and this constant separation. So I would love us to be able to figure out individually and as a community how we can actually be transforming the systems in which we live.
Question from
I want to thank you all for being here and everybody as well, in fact, because I think that it's a start. I have a great respect for Nisreen and Marta, who are friends, for doing this. They know about that already, though. I just wanted to say, on the note of what you said, and somebody was saying about respect earlier, you said, in response to his comment, I definitely agree that it has a lot to do with respect. We have to begin by learning how to respect each individually ourselves. I think, as a Lebanese person, and I'm going to say this, some people might take offense to it, but there's a lot of Lebanese that I find don't respect themselves, and I find that that's why they don't respect others, whether it's their neighbor or the person who's driving next to them or whatever, and therefore they are able to also be racist and classist and sexist and all these different things. So I break it down to that point. I go, I've living here for 9 years and grew up in the US with in a very diverse society. So I have been able to break down that this is one of the problems we have, and there's many reasons why the racism exists, I find, but this is one of them because we don't respect the other. We don't value the other. We don't see the good in the fact that, we don't see the positive side to the diversity that is starting to exist more and more in Lebanon. And there's actually, it's a beautiful thing that luckily that the country is becoming more diverse. But if we don't recognize, if we as a society are not able to appreciate that, it's going to backfire. And it's already starting to, because the institutional racism exists, and because it's institutional racism, it's also within the government, it's like everywhere. It's a virus, it's a cancer, you can call it so many negative things. So I don't really, I was thinking of asking you guys, as an individual, as a Lebanese, as most of the people here are either AUB students or somehow affiliated to the university, how can people begin on their own to try and cleanse themselves, as you said earlier, of this disgusting thing that exists within our society?
Well, I think, thank you, Raya, for the comments. Thank you so much. I think regarding your question, wait, Yasmin has a question as well. Well, regarding addressing how to address racism on an individual level, I mean, like Rania said, to change your language, to think first and know. How do you identify people and how do you identify the other? Like, this would be a good place to start. Like, why do I feel like, why would I think that maybe if we expose the world to more educated Black people, then racism would go away? I mean, like, also to just look at that sentence and that way of thinking and say, okay, maybe there's something wrong with that inherently. Like, so you could start with that. Like, define racism in your context. See what you say to people or what jokes you've made and how your interactions with people contribute to perpetuating racism in the country. Yasmin, do you want to ask a question or? Okay. Because also there's a video that we want to.
Go ahead and use the mic, it's better, thank you.
Actually, my question is just really a simple, practical one. Like, how are you making the problem of racism, one, visible, and how are you making like the Black Lebanese community visible too? I mean, it's not about sending educated African Lebanese to schools, but I think it's really important. I mean, this is a great starting point to discuss it within the walls of AUB, but I think, this discussion definitely needs to very quickly go outside of these walls and go into these schools, go into these various institutions. And yes, it will make a big difference if it's an African Lebanese, doing that. Because it's really strange, this racism. I mean, when I came here to study 14 years ago, and wasn't being introduced to my family, my aunts and uncles. They're wonderful people, all very kind and generous and lovely. But they were racist. I mean, I was kicked out of my grandma's house eventually because she used that word, abdi, to address the domestic worker. and I got into a fight with her, and I got kicked out. But I just couldn't understand, like, the best of people you'd meet were still racist, but they didn't see it. And I think this is what I'm trying to say. How do we make it visible? Like, how do you eventually turn the mirror onto society, onto, I guess I'm asking, really, it's a simple question, really. It's like, how do we make it more visible? And how do we impose this reality? And how do we expose it?
I agree. I think moving around, in terms of moving around the project, that's what we're trying to do. So, how does it help? I mean, engaging. Happy to help. Yes, we will. I will call you after this. But that's the idea of this year's project, because this project was done in 2012. So what we're doing differently this year is that we're trying to take the mountain to Mohammed. Okay, so we're taking this project to different locations and putting it in people's faces. We're moving it to NDU, and we're going to do it at NDU in a very central. It's like on the ground floor, in a hall. So it won't even be in an auditorium. In Sur, we're moving it to the Baladia, so we're now having a collaboration with the municipality. And in Tripoli, we're hoping to do it with a university or school. So this is what we're trying to do with the project. You and Raya bring up a very interesting point. I mean, how do we get people to address their own racism? I mean, I think the first thing I always say to people is like, I'm racist, and I think we should all sit down and question how we think of things and how are we racist. And when you acknowledge that you know your shortcomings and the way you discriminate against people and where your discrimination turns into racism, that's good. So self-acknowledgement and questioning yourself is a good place to start. You as an individual also, like, confronting your grandmother, that was a good thing. I mean, I've done this also in my family. I've had people say I want to get the Sri Lankian to come and clean the house, and it was like it was a Nepali woman, and then I said this to my ex-family member, and she got upset. But it's always good not to be confrontational. I'm not encouraging that, but to have these discussions within your family. I'm not going to say because I'm from Nigeria, my Nigerian side of the family don't have their way of discriminating as well, and I also have that discussion there when I go home. So it's always good to have that discussion within your family, not to be afraid to bring it up, not to be afraid to question yourself. A friend of mine, I would just say this last thing, a friend of mine, this is a very good example, had this discussion with her father saying, I wouldn't mind marrying a black man, because she kind of suspected her father might be opposed to this. And he didn't know how to respond, so he said, but you will have black grandchildren. So, it was a very good, starting, so this is a discussion they had over a few weeks, so it was a good thing that she brought it up. Sometimes we're afraid to discuss with our parents these things, or we're afraid to constantly engaging them in a discussion would be a good way to start, I would think. This is my advice.
I want to bring attention to, there's a mailing list that's being distributed, and this is particular to if you want to volunteer with Insan Association, which would be open for your help. So if you put your name and phone number and email, then Insan would be contacting you, and you would then be part of the effort to try to change the institutionalized form of racism, since it is one of the main organizations that's working on that front. Fateh?
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. We're talking about actually several layers here. I mean, we're talking about cultural racism that is deeply ingrained in culture, but also a personal racism, one that is deeply ingrained in the fact that I see a difference between you and me, so therefore there must be something wrong here. We cannot be the same. If we cannot be the same, then therefore, so that's a psychological aspect. But I think the more important one is the institutional racism that you are talking about. And that has to do with, the institutional racism in a way translates the cultural and the psychological, but it makes it legal. It legalizes and institutionalizes racism. And that's a dangerous thing as well. So what I would like to ask about and talk about is a little bit of the, how if we can attack the institutionalized form of racism, as Rania was saying, and the legalized racism, then perhaps that can also affect, the battle against racism is a long, hard one. The whole world is dealing with it. No country and culture is free of it. It's a huge problem. The US, even after the Civil Rights Act of '63, is still very deeply ingrained. There's a resurgence of racism in Europe in very ugly ways. So it's a big problem. In Lebanon, One avenue is Lebanon is party to the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Discrimination. It is also a party to the two covenants on civil and political rights and economic and social rights. It is a party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child that guarantees education, no matter to everybody in the jurisdiction of the state. So, a question to Insan. Do you know of any efforts to bring legal cases on the basis of these anti-discrimination commitments, legal commitments of Lebanon? That's one. That could be an effort. And secondly, and for everyone, do you know of an organization, a civil society organization that is dedicated or dedicating itself to the battle against racism? I know a lot of human rights organizations who work on, LGBT rights, who work on economic and social rights, child rights, women's rights, etc. Do we know of any that are working specifically on racism and discrimination?
I guess you said it all. Like, it's very important to focus on institutional racism. Regarding the question about if you know any organization that are working on bringing cases, there was a recent precedent. It was brought to court. A domestic worker, with the help of I'm not sure which organization, they brought to court a case of passport confiscation. And it was the first time the judge actually ruled in favor of the domestic worker and declared it illegal to confiscate the passport of the domestic worker, which taps into the kafala system. It touches the heart of it. So there are many cases that are strategically chosen, that take examples, and that, like, step by step can lead to the dismantlement of like the whole process of the kafala. Regarding organizations, I think there's the anti-racism movement. They do a lot of awareness raising and advocacy on the issue of discrimination and racism. It's
called ARM. It's called the Anti-Racism Movement. So
Someone just mentioned CAFA. I mean, a lot of NGOs, yes. So you have CAFA, you have Insan, you have Human Rights Watch. You have a lot of NGOs that target the kafil system and target the fight against racism. Specifically, it would be the anti-racism movement. That's what they do. But their movement. So you raise an interesting point, which is how do we target policies and laws? And I think this is what we have a gap in third sector and civic society, is that we don't have a strong lobbying, a way of lobbying in Lebanon yet. I don't know how to do this. I've read very little on it, so I'm not the person to speak on this topic. But yeah, I think lobbying efforts would be a very good way to change the system. We can do awareness forever, but then we have to do something beyond that.
I'm sorry, I just want to add something with regards to, for instance, the new directive whereby domestic workers are not allowed to have the residency of their children renewed. For instance, there was a joint effort by a number of NGOs who tried to highlight the illegality of this practice with relation to international law, with the relation to the right of family reunification. So there are some action being taken on the front as well.
My name is Bayan Jabir. I'm an intern here at IFI, and I have a personal experience I'd like to talk about. So my sister-in-law is of color, and she lives in Gabon in Africa, and she once came to Lebanon for a vacation. So naturally, she had to get a SIM card, and I was the one to help her do that. We went to a phone shop, and I gave her phone to the guy, and he looked at me and was like, "Why does she have a security code on her phone, your maid? Why does she have to hide?" So I was like, she's my brother's wife, and you're saying is very rude. But yeah, I guess you can understand that it's enrooted in people's mentalities. You know, even the maid shouldn't have a security code on her phone, like what the hell? So yeah.
That's a very interesting comment. I mean, if you ever pass by the vitrines on your way out or here, you will see a lot of quotes that highlight, that touch on this kind of stereotyping and fear. I mean, a lot of the people who participated in the projects mentioned, especially the women, mentioned that, oh, people, I don't mind if someone thinks I'm a maid. This is a very respectful job. This is not the point. The point is that you didn't even say hi to me. You didn't say, hello, how are you, what do you do in Lebanon? And then when I say I'm a maid, you ask me, oh, do you need a job? No, immediately someone drives by you and they say, sorry, and no, are you free on Saturday to clean an office?
directly. So there are these like assumptions that we jump into. I'm not saying that. So that's what we're trying to target with also with the project is that if the majority of people you see in Lebanon are migrant domestic workers, that's fair enough. But you know, there's also a way of treating people, and it's just like say hello, ask them what their name is, ask them what they do, and then you can have the other conversations that tie into that. And also, it's the way people perceive. It's not about color, but color is used as an identifier. So when they see certain features, certain hair, certain color, they already assign you. They already know who you are. And like an example, if I take a cab on any given day, the cab driver will ask me where I'm from. So I will say I'm Lebanese because I'm stubborn, right? I won't tell him I'm Nigerian. No, they won't. So I say I'm Lebanese. I wait. Then he goes, la la la, inti min wen? I say I'm Lebanese. So then I say, okay, I'm Lebanese, but I'm in Nigeria. Ah, but you're really dark. So I'm calm and I'm like, yes. He's like, so you look like your mother because there's no way you could look like your father. So you have your mother's features as well. So it goes beyond color, then it becomes my mother's features. Let me do this exercise. So I bought this because I love my mom. She's very pretty. So can you pass this picture around and then send it back? That's my mom. So just look her face. So I smile. When people say this, I smile. I'm like, yes, I look like my mother. Actually, I look like both my parents. A lot, like my dad when I'm angry. But whatever. So then I keep quiet, and then you feel like because I keep quiet and there's this awkward silence, the cab driver that tries to fix the mistake he's made, and he's like, no, but ما تاخذني, yeah? You're very beautiful, بشرتك كتير hello, and you have very beautiful face, not like Nigerians, you know, they're very black and they're very ugly, and they have this feature. So in the process of apologizing, he's now insulting my mother, so and insulting me because I'm also part Nigerian. So it's quite interesting. What you highlight is something that I mean, we have a bunch of papers when you go through that door, and there's food and drinks. Thank you for waiting so long. So at the end of this, you can go eat, pick a paper up. We put a lot of the quotations from the interviews, so you can take home and you can read. And you'll see themes in there that a lot of people have mentioned, have highlighted that we've brought up in the talk. Any other questions? Yeah.
العمليات اللي بيجوا يشتغلوا بلبنان هلا اوقات كثير بيجوا يعني عم بيجوا على بيئه غير بيئتهم. ما في طريقه اسلوب انه تكون المكاتب تحت مراقبه الجمعيات كفا وهيك تينسقوا مع بعض هن يكونوا مرتاحين لما بيجوا، وهون بلبنان يكونوا مرتاحين لانه عم بيصير كثير مشاكل من قله الثقافه بيناتهم.
قصدك المكاتب تكون عم ينسقوها الجمعيات؟
ايه، لانه المكاتب برا عم بيبعتوهم بكونوا ما بيعرفوا شيء، يعني ما في عندنا ثقافه وعم بيصير عندهم مشاكل هون بلبنان ما عم بيقدروا يتعاملوا معهم.
Okay, the problem is with the recruitment agencies is that they are businesses, and the only entity that can actually regulate the recruitment agencies are like the Ministry of Labor, who can take actually a decision to organize some aspect of their work. What the organizations can do meantime is to act as a watchdog. So whenever the recruitment agencies do an illegal practice or they violate the rights of domestic workers, they can bring this case into the media, into the attention of society. But what's needed is for the organizations to actually lobby for the reform of the recruitment process and not directly monitor them, because we cannot do this like directly.
انجليزي ولا عربي على نفس الموضوع عشان على نفس الموضوع. انا اشتغلت لفتره في مكتب حقوق الانسان بالامم المتحده، وقعدنا حوالي 2.5 3 سنين اشتغلنا على قانون لعاملات المنازل في لبنان بلجنه واسعه ضمت وزاره العدل، وزاره الداخليه، وزاره العمل، ضمت نقابه او تجمع مكاتب الاستخدام، المكاتب اللي بيجيبوا عاملات المنازل، ضمت منظمه العمل الدوليه، واشتغلنا 2.5 على سن قانون وخناق وصياح وكذا ونقاش واخذ وعطى والى اخره، عشان مش إلغاء نظام الكفالة بهذا المعنى، وإنما ضمان حقوق عاملات المنازل بما فيها كانت مكاتب الاستخدام، لأنه معظم الانتهاكات بتيجي من عندهم معظمها، إضافة له وهذا بتكمل في البيوت. لحد الآن لسه ما مشي القانون. نحكي عن 6 سنين. Just to say it very quickly, we worked when I was with the UN Human Rights Office for a time. We worked with various ministries, with the ILO, with the offices that, you know, the employment offices that bring domestic workers, etc., to put together a law on domestic workers to protect the rights of migrant domestic workers. For about 2.5 years, worked very hard. The draft law is there. Almost everything is agreed, and everything is frozen, like almost everything else in Lebanon.
I just also have a question about that law. Is it, does it have a section about recruitment agencies? Does it address? Yeah?
The responsibilities and legal responsibilities of recruitment agencies. I can talk.
If we don't, do we have any questions in the back? Because if we don't, we have a video we would like to play that's sort of funny and that might, you know, get you thinking about the way we think about the other.
Can I just add one little without a microphone? Very nice. I just want to raise one simple point, because you're raising about racism, you're talking about sexism, we're talking about actually something that exists all over the world, not only in Lebanon. And because we're always talking about Lebanese being racist, but it's really in France, which they preach diplomacy and acceptance. It exists really everywhere, and it's not about only race, it's about everything. It's about the way you dress, the way you talk, the way you eat. As long as you're different, there's a problem there. So Nisreen talked about be the change you want to see in the world, basically, in a nutshell, which is it's every single one of us needs to change. It's not, we cannot even point fingers at those who are in the government or those who are in institutions. We all need to raise awareness to ourselves first. And yes, I truly believe that by, there's something, I'm sorry, I didn't introduce myself at first, but my project has been to create a culture hub where we're gathering all the people who are trying and doing a change in the world, starting with themselves. So the name is Our Qualia, which is exactly what you're talking about, which comes from Latin, which means our perception, the way we see the world. So basically, if I lived all my life in a black and white room, if you give me the definition of the color red, I will never be able to perceive it. It's not in my dictionary, it's not in my perception, it's not in my world. So introducing your project to the whole Lebanon, and of course in schools and in universities and all of these things, is already the change that you're going to be doing in the world. You don't, it would, everything else would come automatically. Because I truly believe that when people start talking and the gossip, and especially in countries like Lebanon, it's through gossip that you can make a change. So if we are having a big problem with laws and we're having a big problem with constitutions and all of these things, make the gossip, the government will get the word in a second, and they will only want but to be in the trend. So again, thank you so much for this, and thank you for all your efforts.
Thank you for the comment and for your